assign additional reading assignments, but I want you to read in your textbook as we go along. So if you've not already done so, please read chapter 17 on the blood. Okay? Next week, in lab, we'll be jumping ahead to chapter 20, which will do lecture in the lab. And there's going to be material both for the lab and the lecture. That'll be on the lymphatic system. It's a relatively short chapter. I suggest you read that. So if you're having fun in the sun this weekend, take a little time off. Take a little study. Chapter 17 and chapter 20. As I said, chapter 20 in lab, we'll do the lecture in lab, okay? Because I haven't talked about the lymphatic system yet. And that'll be material both for lecture and lab. Okay, so some of that material that we're doing on Monday will be on the lab exam on Wednesday. So just a nasty reminder, okay? Next Wednesday, our first lab test. And that will cover through Tuesday's lab. So we'll cover the blood cells, which you did on Wednesday, all right? And what you did today, or doing today, on the blood tests. And there are a few, okay? And then also on the lymphatic system. That's mostly slides, which we went over Monday and Tuesday, okay? Just a heads up on that, all right? So you notice we move pretty fast in here, but consider every 2 days is 1 week. So after today, we'll finish the first week of class. And normal during the fall semester. Okay.
So do we still have lecture Monday then?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
We'll continue the blood. Okay, but like I said, I'm jumping ahead in lab because I'm covering the lymphatic system. Since I have a lecture on that, I'll give you a little mini lecture in lab. Okay, but that'll be for both lab and lecture. All right. Okay, in the meantime, we've been talking about the blood. And by now you should know functions of the blood. Right, the blood isn't just for transport, which most people are aware of. It carries things around the body. This could be nutrients and oxygen, and also waste products, including carbon dioxide. It also carries enzymes, which catalyze reactions, okay, hormones, which are chemical regulators. It also, though, is involved in regulation. Regulation, helping to regulate body temperature by increasing or decreasing blood flow in the dermis of the skin. When we're overly warm, you know, we sweat. Sweat, of course, is mostly water. It's deposited on the surface of the skin. As that sweat evaporates, as it goes from liquid to gaseous state, that takes energy, energy in the form of heat. You take heat away from something, you cool it. At the same time, you're channeling more blood through the skin, the dermis, so the skin's acting like a radiator. So you're cooling that blood as it passes through those cooler tissues as a result of the evaporation of the sweat. That then channels back to the core and helps to cool the rest of the body. Okay? And some animals, they may not sweat much, but basically, like a dog, for example. How does a dog cool? It's got that tongue out, okay? And it's very wet, and it's panting across it. So it's got an airflow across that. It's evaporating the fluid from the tongue, and what that does is cool the tongue, and that acts like a radiator, helps to cool as well. So, but in the meantime, like I say, the blood flow through the skin increases when we're overly warm. When we're cold, we reduce blood flow, so we retard heat loss and help to maintain blood flow. Okay? Also, we saw the blood is important in regulation of pH. pH, of course, is a quantitative measure of acidity or alkalinity, and it's very important we maintain a fairly narrow range of pH because the body cannot tolerate either extremes of pH, acidic or basic, because this can drastically affect the central nervous system. So, for this reason, the blood is buffered, as are many body fluids, and a buffer, you may or may not realize, is something that retards or inhibits changes in pH. Because you want to keep the pH fairly stable. And in the blood, as I point out, the pH is normally between 7.35 and 7.45. pH scale, if you're not familiar, is a logarithmic scale from 0 to 14. Middle scale is 7. That means it's either acid or base. If you go above 7, then 14 becomes increasingly basic or alkaline. If you drop below 7, it becomes increasingly acidic. Acid is associated with hydrogen ion concentration, base with base ions, and a major one, of course, is hydroxide ions. And in the body, we're talking usually about bicarbonate ions, which are the mild base. Okay? Have a question? Okay, so we see regulation of body temperature. We also see regulation of pH, helping to maintain a fairly stable pH. Okay? Also regulation of fluid balance. And how does the blood do that?
Sodium ion.
How does it maintain fluid balance? And we're talking about balance between the blood and other tissues. How does water move? Because we're talking about water here. Moves by what process? Osmosis, okay? Osmosis is a passive process in which a solvent, in this case water, is moving across a selectively or differentially permeable membrane, okay? And it's always going, as in any passive process, from higher concentration of substance to lower concentration. As I said, something to remember is water follows the solute. The solute's what's dissolved, okay, in the water. Because our body fluids are solutions, and water being the solvent, the dissolving agent, and various salts or solutes within it, okay? So by changing the solute concentration, you can move the water. If water follows the solute, means where you got a higher solute concentration, you got lower water, water flows in. Got a lower solute concentration, more water, water flows out. We talk about hypertonic versus hypotonic. Hypertonic means high solute concentration, low water. Water flows in, okay? In other words, it draws water out. And hypotonic, high water, low solute, water flows out. If you have trouble remembering this, think about salt water or seawater. Seawater is what kind of a solution relative to our body fluids? Hypertonic or hypotonic? Hyper. That's when you drink seawater, okay, what happens? You get thirstier, because it literally is pulling water out of the cells that bathe the GI tract. So you're dehydrating yourself, because you're exposing those cells to a hypertonic solution, pulling water out passively, okay? So think about that. So by adjusting solute concentration in the blood, you can basically maintain fluid balance. Okay? Now what are we talking about in the blood? What are the solutes?
Nutrients.
All sorts of electrolytes, which are
Electrolytes.
ions like sodium, chloride, and so on. And what else? What?
Hormones.
Well, not so much hormones, but what? What do we have circulating in our blood? We talked about it.
Gases.
Well, yeah, but that's not soluble. Plasma proteins, remember? These are proteins that normally stay in the blood, have various functions, okay, like the albumin, the globulins, alpha and beta globulin, gamma globulin, and so on. These are actually proteins that are in the blood, and they act as solutes too. So they can basically help to maintain fluid balance. Okay? We also said another function of blood is protection. Protection against blood loss, because the blood has the ability to clot. Okay? And also protection against foreign invaders. And this is virtually, or basically has to do with your white blood cells. As I said, we'll talk about that in more detail in chapter 21 on the immune system. Okay? So you should know these functions of the blood that we went over. And we went over the plasma last time, and the plasma, remember, is a little more than half of the blood. That's mostly, that is the fluid, it's mostly what? Plasma is mostly what?
Water.
Okay, about 90% or more. And then various things dissolved in it, various solutes, and various things suspended. What's suspended, of course, would be the formed elements. Take a little less than half of the blood, and the formed elements are what? The blood cells, okay? Red blood cells, erythrocytes, white blood cells, leukocytes, and cell fragments called
Platelets.
platelets or thrombocytes. Okay? And you had fun on Monday, Wednesday, okay? Looking at those, okay? By now you should have some appreciation of what they look like. Hopefully, by Wednesday you'll be experts on this. Okay? So, and we got as far then as the formed elements. To start talking about the formed elements, which we're going to do now and look at them in a little more detail than we did in the lab. And the first formed element, which is the most numerous, obviously, I think you realize right away, are the red blood cells. Red blood cells, somewhere between maybe 4 to 6 million per cubic millimeter. Again, you don't have to worry about the number, but there are a lot of them. And they make up about 99% or slightly more of the formed elements. And of course, the blood count varies from person to person, generally higher in men than women. And the red blood cells, of course, are the smallest of the blood cells, usually about 7.5 micrometers in diameter, or micrometers 1/1 billion. And remember the shape. The shape is described as being a biconcave disc, which means they're coin-shaped, a little indentation or concavity on either side. Biconcave. They are very small in size, and they have a very large surface area relative to volume. As the cell increases in size, its volume increases, obviously, so does its surface area, but not at the same rate. The volume actually increases faster than the surface area. So a smaller cell will have a greater surface area relative to volume. So the advantage of this is, having a very large surface area relative to volume is, it's got more surface, which facilitates gas exchange. Okay? Because remember, what's the function of a red blood cell? It's to carry, well, it's got hemoglobin in it, but its function is to carry respiratory gases, primarily oxygen, and to a lesser extent, carbon dioxide. When I say gas exchange, that's movement of gas across the membrane. It's got to pick up oxygen and give off oxygen. And same thing with carbon dioxide. So with having more surface area relative to volume, being a small cell, especially with the concave or the depression on either side, you got more surface area relative to volume. What does that do? That facilitates gas exchange, or aids in gas exchange. So it makes it easier for the cell to carry out its function, which is to carry these respiratory gases. Okay? So very large surface area relative to volume aids in gas exchange. That's what goes this way. Also, it's very flexible. The cells are very flexible. And the fact that they are very flexible is important because when they pass through the smallest blood vessels in the body, which are capillaries, sometimes the capillaries are only that much larger in diameter than is the diameter of the blood cell, the red blood cell. So they basically have to flex, especially when they're going around the bend. They sometimes line up in single file and just kind of bend as they make the turn. So they have to be flexible cells. Okay, so very flexible. So they can squeeze through the small capillaries. Again, the capillaries are the smallest of the blood vessels. They have to be able to do this in order to get through these vessels. Because some are so small that they're barely larger than the diameter of the blood cell. So their size, the fact that they have the depression on either side gives them more surface area. That facilitates gas exchange. The fact that they're very flexible allows them to bend to make it through these very small blood vessels. Okay? And something you should have noticed, something that's true of all mammalian blood, and of course humans are mammals, they lack a nucleus. They start life with a nucleus and the typical organelles that we see in most cells, but they expel them as they mature. And what this does basically is increase efficiency for gas transport because it makes more space available to carry those respiratory gases within the cell. It allows them basically to carry more hemoglobin and thus carry more oxygen and carbon dioxide, which is bound in hemoglobin inside the red blood cell. So there's a reason for getting rid of these organelles. It allows them to do their job better. And notice too, red blood cells, of course, are living cells like any other cell. They have to have energy. Where they get the energy? From ATP, like any other cell. But they don't generate their ATP aerobically, which means they use oxygen. They do it anaerobically, which is nice. So they're carrying oxygen, but they're not using what they carry. Okay? Like the eunuch guarding the harem. The eunuch is, okay? The castrated male, okay? In some Middle Eastern cultures, of course, the sultan has his harem, these beautiful young things. Of course, he didn't want anybody, tampering with them, so you got these big muscular guys with the big swords. You've probably seen them in cartoons, okay? And they were usually castrated, so they didn't bother the females. But he could trust them basically to protect his women, okay? So like I say, here's the cell. It's very well adapted to carry oxygen. It's very well adapted to pick up oxygen, give off oxygen, and it doesn't use what it carries. So it spreads or carries the oxygen out to the cells, but it doesn't use the oxygen because it generates ATP anaerobically, lactic acid transportation. Okay? And again, notice that most of the oxygen, about 98.5% of the oxygen, is carried this way, chemically bound to the hemoglobin. inside the red blood cells. Okay. Now, the hemoglobin itself is the protein molecule inside the red blood cells to which both the oxygen and the carbon dioxide binds. But they bind at different parts of the molecule. So the same molecule can carry both gases. And the iron, or I should say the oxygen, binds to iron in what are called heme groups. There are 4 polypeptide chains in a hemoglobin molecule. Remember, a polypeptide is a chain of amino acids. All proteins, okay, are polypeptides, but not all polypeptides are proteins. What I mean by that? I mean, depending on the number of amino acids, it can be classified as a protein if it has a certain minimum number of amino acids in the polypeptide chain, usually 50 or more. If it's less than that, it's just called a polypeptide, but not a protein, because it has too few to be classified as a protein. But again, 4 chains of amino acids, 4 polypeptide chains. Each one has with it associated what's called a heme group. And this consists of the globin, which are the 4 polypeptide chains, and an iron-containing red pigment, which is called the heme group. It's to the heme group that the oxygen molecules bind. And since each molecule of hemoglobin has 4 heme groups, 4 per molecule, and a typical red blood cell can carry up to 250 million hemoglobin molecules, that's a quarter billion, with 1 oxygen binding to each one, you can see that theoretically at least, each red blood cell has the potential to carry 1 billion molecules of oxygen. And we consider that in a cubic millimeter of blood, which is less than a teaspoon, you have something order maybe 4 to 6 million red blood cells. And the average person has somewhere between maybe 4.5 and 6 liters of blood in their body. Think of the tremendous oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and also the tremendous oxygen demands that we have. And that's why it's essential that we maintain circulation. If the heart stops, you're in trouble. You're not circulating that blood, which means you're not getting the oxygen out to the tissues, and they start to die off very quickly, especially those tissues that are very metabolically active, like tissues in the nervous system, neurons, for example, and the heart itself. You don't have to memorize this, but this is just FYI, okay? All right, the typical lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days, after which it is destroyed by the body. They're worn out. And since it doesn't have the typical organelles, it can't synthesize new proteins or reproduce or divide itself, so it's simply destroyed and replaced by new red blood cells. So this is an ongoing process. Every second, you're destroying millions of red blood cells and you're producing millions of new red blood cells. You don't just go to sleep one night and clear all the red blood cells. It's an ongoing process. And what happens is, of course, you break down the red blood cells, and what breaks them down? Macrophages. Where do macrophages come from? They come from the monocytes, which remember are a type of white blood cell. When the monocyte leaves the blood, gets in other tissues, it becomes a macrophage. Good name. Macrophage means big eater. That's what it is. It gobbles up debris, including worn out red blood cells. And this occurs in the liver, it occurs in your spleen, and also in the bone marrow, which is the blood cell forming tissue of the body. And again, it's an ongoing process. The fate then is the hemoglobin within the red blood cells is split into globin, and those are the polypeptide chains containing amino acids and heme groups. So the globin then is broken down into amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks of protein, so they can be recycled and used to make new body proteins. Your body is saving these. Okay? So again, globin from the broken down red blood cells, polypeptides, the chains of amino acids. They're broken down into individual amino acids, and then they can be reassembled to make new proteins. Okay? That's the fate of that. The heme groups are split into two parts. They're split into iron and a non-iron portion. The iron itself is stored by the body, and it's stored in complex with proteins. Iron itself is toxic, so it's never alone. It's always in complex with proteins. So it's stored in the body in the form of what's called ferritin or hemosiderin. And again, these are both protein-iron complexes in which the iron is stored in the body. And again, it comes from breakdown of the iron, okay, from the heme groups. And where is it stored? It's stored within cells in the liver, muscles, and it's stored in cells in the liver, and again, it's in protein complexes. So liver, muscles, and bone marrow. And again, this is the red bone marrow. It's the blood cell forming tissue of the body. We also have, remember, yellow bone marrow. That's usually the diaphysis or shafts and long bones. That's mostly the fat. The red bone marrow is usually in the epiphyses or in some of the other bones, flat bones, the radial bones, and so on, the little cavities, okay, between the trabeculae and the so-called spongy bone. So again, the iron is being stored. And eventually then the iron is going to be carried back, and it's not already in the red bone marrow. It's going to be carried back in the blood, again in complex with protein. That's called transferrin. So it's being transferred back, attached to the protein, and it's carried back in the blood to the red bone marrow. And of course, there it's used in the manufacture of more hemoglobin. So, red blood cells broken down by macrophages in these tissues. Liver, spleen, red bone marrow. Okay? The globin part, that's the protein part. Okay? Split into amino acids. Amino acids reassemble to make new proteins. The heme groups split into the iron and non-iron portion. The iron portion, iron is complex with proteins, either as ferritin or hemosiderin, and stored in cells within the liver, muscle, and bone marrow. And then eventually, it's not in the red bone marrow already, it's going to be carried back to the red bone marrow in the blood, again complex with protein, and that's known as transferrin. And then back in the red bone marrow, of course, as it gets back to the red bone marrow, then it's used to make new red blood cells. Again, red blood cells, we're going to see that in fact all blood cells, be they red blood cells, white blood cells, and even platelets, all originate from our red bone marrow. That is the blood cell forming tissue of the body. Or you can say the formed elements. This is where they start, in the red bone marrow. Okay? Now, the non-iron portion of the hemoglobin, what happens to that? That's a waste product. That's going to be expelled from the body. Okay? Bilirubin, for example. This is kind of a yellow-orange bile pigment. So the non-iron portion of the heme group are the bile pigments. And these basically are going to be carried to the liver that's going to secrete them into the small intestine in the bile, which it produces. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the digestive system. This is a component of the bile. And again, these are waste products, so they will pass out with the feces. So the bilirubin itself, and it's often converted to other bile pigments, but all of them pass out with the feces, and that's what gives the color to the feces, usually kind of a brownish color. It can vary, of course, depending on what's in your diet, but basically your ground color. Where does it come from? It comes from the breakdown of the hemoglobin, and specifically the non-iron portion of the heme groups, biopigments. And the major one, bilirubin. Again, it's picked up by the liver excretes it into bile, into the small intestine, then passed out as a waste product. Okay? Any questions on this? Okay, so we covered the breakdown, the destruction of red blood cells, but in the meantime, we got to be producing new red blood cells as an ongoing process. And this starts, the process is known as erythropoiesis. And this is an ongoing process in the red bone marrow, and primarily the bones of the axial skeleton. Okay? What's the axial skeleton? What do we mean by that? The bones along the axis, okay? Skull, vertebral column, okay? So axial skeleton, but also some of the girdles. The pelvic girdle, which of course is the hip, and the pectoral girdle, shoulder. And in addition, the epiphyses of the humerus. Humerus, remember, is the upper arm bone, and the femur, that's your thigh bone. And the epiphyses, remember, are the expanded ends of the long bones. This is where you have your red bone marrow. Okay? So red blood cells and the other formed elements as well all develop from the same stem cell. There's a lot of talk these days about stem cells. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells that give rise to other cells in the body. Okay? We've got a lot of different stem cells. But these stem cells are called hemocytoblasts. And usually when you see the suffix blast, that means it's a undifferentiated cell. It's going to give rise to other types of cells, like fibroblasts, for example, or osteoblasts, or chondroblasts, and so on. These are also stem cells, undifferentiated. It also has another name. It's called the hematopoietic stem cell. But the same cell goes through different maturation processes to produce all the different blood cells, be they red blood cells, 5 different categories of white blood cells, or platelets. They all come from the same stem cell. What determines what pathway they're going to go? Hormones. Okay? And in this case, the hormone is called erythropoietin. The process of red blood cell production is erythropoiesis. The hormone that governs this is erythropoietin. That's what converts this stem cell along this pathway that results in the formation of red blood cells. Okay? And notice the hormone is produced primarily by the kidneys. The kidneys are very sensitive to blood pressure, and also oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Also, to a lesser extent, the liver too. And again, this is an ongoing process, so this hormone is constantly being produced. The amount produced depends on how many blood cells you need. Because there are some cases where you may need more red blood cells. You've had a major bleed or hemorrhage. Obviously, you need to replace those red blood cells. Okay? But this is continually secreted, and again, the level determines what number of red blood cells are going to be produced. Primary originates in kidneys, but also to a lesser extent the liver.
I have a question. Is that ongoing, the red blood cells, the stem cells, are they being ongoing in the different parts of the body? Like the axial skeleton and
It's an ongoing process, yes. So these
It's
hemocytoblasts,
constantly going on, no matter.
it's going on all the time. Every second of your life, you're producing more red blood cells and you're destroying old, worn out red blood cells by the millions. So it's an ongoing process, like I said. Even when you're at rest, parts of your body are not at rest. They're actively doing something. Okay. So again, the hormone then is being released by the kidneys, to a lesser extent the liver. It's carried by the blood, where? Back to the red bone marrow, which is where the cells are being manufactured. And as I said, more is going to be released if there's an oxygen deficiency. Because again, it's the red blood cells that are carrying the oxygen, the majority of the oxygen. And this oxygen deficiency is known as hypoxia. So with hypoxia, you have an increase in release of erythropoietin, you have an increase in the production of red blood cells, according to the needs of the body. Now hypoxia, of course, is due to low oxygen levels in the blood. And this can be due to a variety of factors. One thing is a reduced red blood cell count. You have fewer than normal red blood cells. And this is normally due to an obvious reason. One would be bleeding. When you bleed, of course, you're losing blood cells, including lots of red blood cells. So bleeding or hemorrhaging, reduced red blood cell count, either bleeding or hemorrhaging. It can also be due to excessive breakdown or destruction. This often results of toxins. Toxins are poisonous. So, bleeding, excessive red blood cell destruction due to toxins, what are called hemorrhagic toxins. And this would usually be from a venomous animal, like a rattlesnake, for example. Rattlesnake toxin is hemorrhagic, breaks down red blood cells. Okay, so that's one reason. You have a reduced red blood cell count, and that can contribute to hypoxia or lower than normal oxygen level of blood. Okay, a second factor is reduced oxygen availability in the blood. In this case, this can be due to, very simply, living at higher altitudes. We're not talking about the Appalachian Mountains, where the highest peak is, I think, about 600 feet, Mount Mitchell. I'm talking about going to the Rocky Mountains, okay? Where you've got some peaks that, here in Colorado, they advertise they've got 60 peaks over 14,000 feet elevation, okay? If you're out there hiking the mountains, you come from a place like Florida, first thing you find is you have no energy at all. Because you're not used to breathing that air with low oxygen content. So you have a lower than normal oxygen carrying capacity, okay? Reduced availability of oxygen, even at these higher altitudes. Now, eventually your body will accommodate that and you'll produce a higher number of red blood cells than you would if you were living here in Florida. To give you a higher oxygen carrying capacity. Okay, so living at high altitudes, also chronic lung disease. It contributes to reduced oxygen availability. We're talking about chronic lung disease, it basically decreases respiratory surface area. For gas exchange. What happens in your lungs is, you take in air, as you know, as you breathe in and out, and then the air then passes across the walls, the tiny little air sacs in our lungs, into the blood capillaries that surround them. We call this gas exchange. Oxygen passes from the air sacs into the blood, carbon dioxide passes from the blood back to the air sacs. You're taking air in, higher in oxygen, and the air you exhale has a lower or a higher carbon dioxide content than the air you took in. So anything that interferes with gas exchange is going to reduce oxygen availability in the blood. And the third thing is increased tissue demand. obvious thing here, of course, would be aerobic exercise. So again, when you're exercising, of course, your oxygen demands increase. So that could result temporarily in hypoxia or lower than normal oxygen levels in the blood. Any questions on this? Okay, let's take a look now at disorders associated with red blood cells, erythrocytes. Okay, first off, anemia. We talked a little about this in lab this morning. We'll do it again this afternoon. Anemia, by definition, is a condition in which the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is lower than it should be. It's lower than normal. And frequently it's a sign or symptom of the disease rather than actually a disease itself. So a lower than normal oxygen carrying capacity of blood is anemia. Now several things can bring this about. First off, inadequate number of red blood cells. That's an obvious thing. If the red blood cells are carrying the oxygen, you don't have a normal number of red blood cells, that can contribute to anemia. So the first one there, insufficient red blood cells. And one, insufficient red blood cells, again, can be due to the obvious, bleeding. Losing blood, obviously you're going to be using or losing red blood cells. Again, red blood cell destruction. Resulting in insufficient red blood cells. And this can be due to congenital defects, or it can be due to, again, infection. Both can result in red blood cell destruction. So various parasitic infections, some bacterial infections, or congenital defects will all give rise to this. Reduced red blood cells, or insufficient red blood cells. Another thing would be, so again, it's under insufficient number of red blood cells. Another thing would be red bone marrow destruction or inhibition. Remember, that's when the blood cells are being made. Red bone marrow destruction or inhibition. And again, this can be due to certain drugs, it can be due to certain toxins, it can be due to ionizing radiation. Yes?
I have a question. If you are anemic, can a doctor prescribe you medicine? Is there medication that slows down the destruction process of destroying the red blood cells?
Well, if you're anemic, it's often because maybe you're iron deficient, or maybe you're pernicious anemia, got a vitamin B12 deficiency. It's usually some deficiency in that case. Okay. Especially if we're prescribing something for it. You know, take this supplement. Okay. And it may, often it's just iron deficiency. Actually, this should be number 2. This should be number 3. So red blood cell bleeding, red blood cell destruction, red bone marrow destruction or inhibition. 1, 2, 3. Okay. All can contribute to insufficient red blood cells. Okay. Another thing that contribute to anemia is not enough hemoglobin. And this can be the result of a couple of diseases, especially iron deficiency anemia, which means you're deficient in iron, or you have impaired absorption of iron. That brings about what's called iron deficiency anemia. In which case the red blood cells are not going to look normal, they're going to look smaller than normal, and they're also going to be pale because you don't have enough hemoglobin, so you're lighter than normal. Okay, so decreased hemoglobin content, either you don't absorb enough iron or you don't have enough iron in your diet. Iron deficiency anemia. A second type of anemia is called pernicious anemia. This is due to another deficiency, but in this case it's not iron, it's vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is required for proper development of your red blood cells. If you don't have vitamin B12, what happens is you form abnormal red blood cells. They tend to be larger than normal. And again, this can be because you don't have enough vitamin B12 in your diet, but more likely it's a problem with absorption of vitamin B12. Our stomach, among other things, produces what is called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor passes from the stomach into the small intestine, and there it's needed for absorption of vitamin B12. So if you're not producing intrinsic factor or enough intrinsic factor, you'll end up with abnormal red blood cells and go into what's called pernicious anemia. If you have, for example, a stomach removed or a stomach stapling operation, which some people do to help control weight, a drastic way to do it, you may be on vitamin B12 supplements the rest of your life because you probably won't be producing enough intrinsic factor, you won't be absorbing enough vitamin B12, and the result will be pernicious anemia. It's not treated. So again, pernicious anemia due to a vitamin B12 deficiency. Vitamin B12 is essential for proper red blood cell production, and again, it's often due to improper absorption. You don't have enough intrinsic factor.
So what is intrinsic factor?
What is it? It's a peptide produced by the stomach, and it passes in the small intestine, and there it's required for absorption of vitamin B12. So like I said, often pernicious anemia is a problem of absorption. You're not absorbing enough. It may be because you're not producing intrinsic factor or enough intrinsic factor. If you lose the stomach or a good part of it, you're often got a problem. That's why you're often on vitamin B12 the rest of your life. Because you're not producing enough intrinsic factor, you're not absorbing the vitamin B12, you go into pernicious anemia as a result. Okay. Another thing that contributes to anemia is abnormal hemoglobin. So in this case, you have hemoglobin, but you don't have normal hemoglobin, or at least not enough of it. And there are two common diseases here that are associated with abnormal hemoglobin. These are both genetic diseases. Okay, you don't get them from another person. Actually, it's passed from mother to child. So it's genetically determined. And it's due to a defective gene. In one case, disease is known as thalassemias. In thalassemias, again, it's a hereditary disease. In this case, the red blood cell count is much lower than normal because they tend to be much more fragile. And they're more fragile than normal because the hemoglobin is an abnormal hemoglobin, in that it lacks a polypeptide chain. Normal hemoglobin has 4 polypeptide chains. In the thalassemias, you only got 3. The result is abnormal hemoglobin, and the result is cells that have that abnormal hemoglobin tend to be more fragile and break. The result is, of course, when you lose red blood cells, have lowered oxygen carrying capacity, anemia. This is most common in people of Mediterranean ancestry. People live around the Mediterranean Sea. Again, it's passed from mother to child. You don't pick it up. It's not a contagious disease. These are thalassemias. Again, it's due to a defective gene. Okay, another disease fits in the same category of abnormal hemoglobin is called sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, again, is due to a gene, defective gene, that basically the person that has it produces abnormal hemoglobin. In this case, the cells that carry the abnormal hemoglobin, when they give off their oxygen, they form a sickle shape. There's a picture in your book. If you got your textbook handy, okay, on page 642 in the latest edition, there's a picture showing a normal red blood cell and then a blood cell that contains the abnormal hemoglobin. And you can see it has kind of a sickle shape. That's the term sickle cell anemia. These cells, though, tend to be more fragile than normal cells. As a result, they tend to break. When they break, of course, that reduces the oxygen carrying capacity because you've got fewer than normal red blood cells. And secondly, those cells will clog small blood vessels and restrict circulation. So it can cause organ damage as a result of that. This is most common in people of African ancestry, particularly people whose ancestors originated in the malarial belts of Africa. And the reason is, people that have what's called sickle cell trait, which means they don't have the disease, they produce normal hemoglobin, but they produce some abnormal hemoglobin. They got some normal cells and some abnormal. And usually under conditions of low oxygen, you're going to see some mild signs and symptoms of the disease in these people. But for the most part, perfectly normal. But if two people with sickle cell trait have a child, the result can be the child with sickle cell anemia. That can be a very nasty disease. Because again, it'll produce this abnormal hemoglobin, a lot of cells will break, have a lower oxygen carrying capacity, and those cells will tend to clog small blood vessels and restrict circulation as well. And that's sickle cell anemia. Now what bearing does that have to malaria? Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease. The malarial parasite is a protozoan that grows inside the red blood cells of humans, and the process destroys the red blood cells. Pardon me? Yeah, it's a parasite. It's a little protozoan parasite. It's in red blood cells. It's spread by infected mosquitoes. Okay? And malaria is found in many tropical and subtropical areas of the world. It is one of the biggest killers of humanity in the world today, much more than AIDS. Malaria and tuberculosis kill more people than any other diseases. And this is one of the worst diseases. There is no vaccine for it. There are drugs, but in some cases the parasite has become resistant to the drugs. So the drugs don't always work. If you're going into a malarial area, you'll take prophylactic drugs, but they'll tell you wear insect repellent, sleep with mosquito netting, try to avoid being bitten by mosquitoes. And don't go crossing through the brush at night where you're likely to get bitten, okay? You want to stay away from that. Because where are the mosquitoes hanging out? In the brush. And where are they most active? At night, at twilight.
You said it's a parasite that kills the red blood cells?
Yes, it gets in red blood cells, multiplies in red blood cells, and destroys red blood cells in the process. Okay? And the result is severe damage and in many cases death, as I said, especially in children. It takes a tremendous toll in children. Okay. At any rate though, and malaria has been known for a long time. Back in Roman times, the disease comes from malaria, meaning bad air. The Romans realized that malaria was quite common. They didn't know what caused it, but it was around the swampy areas. So they thought it was the bad air emanating from the swamps that gave you malaria. And in fact, we know this is prime breeding area for mosquitoes. So you were being bitten by mosquitoes. That's what gave you malaria, not the air. Okay? That's the term, malaria, bad air. Okay? But again, people with sickle cell trait are more resistant to malaria than those with normal hemoglobin. So more likely to survive, and therefore the trait persists. So these people, though, are in areas where there's no malaria, like the U.S. and many Western countries, it's a disadvantage. Because if two people with sickle cell trait, I said, have children, they can have children with sickle cell anemia. Okay? And the astounding thing is, the abnormal hemoglobin differs from normal hemoglobin in 2 amino acids. This molecule has some 584 or so amino acids. In 2 of the polypeptide chains, you got 1 amino acid in place of another. That's the difference that causes this disease, which seems rather astounding. But the gene basically codes for the wrong amino acid, and you end up with the wrong hemoglobin or abnormal hemoglobin, and that gives you the disease, sickle cell anemia. Okay. Again, in both cases, there are thalassemias, abnormal hemoglobin because you're lacking a polypeptide chain through step 4, and here, abnormal hemoglobin, which is different in a couple of amino acids in to the chains, the polypeptide.
Question.
Yeah.
My brother has sickle cell anemia. Why is his eyes yellow?
Why what?
Are his eyes yellow?
Because he's probably, he's probably breaking out a lot of red blood cells. And the red blood cells, you're going to have the non-heme portion, which is the pigment. And that pigment can accumulate and be deposited in the skin and also in the whites of the eyes, to give you that yellow color.
He has the disease and my sister has the plague.
Really. Yeah, he probably suffers glaucoma too. Very
Since he
nasty.
was 6 months old.
Yeah.
How old is he now?
32.
It's a nasty disease.
He's
32.
32. They
Isn't
thought he
the
was going to
lifespan
die.
about,
Yeah, some die in
They thought he was
childhood,
gonna
but you can
die at
survive to
16,
adulthood, but it's,
but
like I say, it's a nasty sign of symptoms associated with it.
he's
Wow.
always in and out of the hospital.
Okay, another abnormality concerning red blood cells is polycythemia. Now, we've been talking so far about too few red blood cells, or red blood cells that have abnormal hemoglobin, or not enough hemoglobin. And now we got the other extreme, too much or too many red blood cells. So here, polycythemia, you got more than the normal number of red blood cells. Polycythemia vera is a pathological condition. In this case, you have a tremendous number of red blood cells, and that's great, you carry more oxygen. It's not great because the blood becomes so viscous that it's hard to circulate. It becomes so thick because it's clogged with red blood cells. It's very difficult. The heart has to work harder to pump that blood. That's called polycythemia vera, and here you may have something between 8 and 11 million red blood cells per cubic milliliter of blood. Normally you have maybe 4.5 to 6. So in some cases almost double red blood cell count. Like I say, this is abnormal. It's usually a result of a red bone marrow tumor. Which results in overproduction of red blood cells. So that's polycythemia vera. And again, that's a pathological or disease condition. Secondary polycythemia is something the body does when it's exposed to oxygen, or to the air containing lower oxygen content. Okay? You spend the summer in the Rockies, okay? As I said, you first get out there, you have no energy, okay? You're dying, okay? Because you're breathing this air with a lower oxygen content, you're not used to it. How does your body respond? It responds by producing more red blood cells. We call that secondary polycythemia. So this is a normal condition in response to low oxygen content in the air that you're breathing. And this is why, too, we have an Olympic training facility in Colorado Springs, Colorado. A lot of Olympic caliber athletes will train out there at this higher altitude, and what they do, they're building up their red blood cell count. That's not blood doping, which is illegal, okay, but this is perfectly legal. And that's why, too, a lot of very good runners, like a lot of from Kenya who train in the mountains, excellent runners, long distance runners, because they're used to these high altitudes, they got higher red blood cell count than normal, and they tend to perform very well on these aerobic events, like marathons and distance events. But again, we all can respond with what's called secondary polycythemia. We produce more red blood cells. That's not the abnormally high count that you have in polycythemia vera. So this actually helps you, okay, increase your oxygen carrying capacity. Do you have a question, Hunter?
I just needed verification of secondary, so it's just a production of.
Secondary means you don't have as high a number, but it's in response to a low oxygen content in the air, like at high altitudes. Okay. So you say, if you go out to Colorado and start hiking in the mountains, okay, some of those passes maybe 9 or 10,000 feet, you'll feel it initially. And eventually, like what it is, you just as they do. Your body is responding by producing more red blood cells.
So because of the high altitude, it produces more red blood cells.
Yeah, you're going to respond by producing more red blood cells because you're breathing air with a lower oxygen content. Like I said, when you first go out there, and I've lived in Colorado, there's no energy. And after a while, you feel pretty good. You get used to it. So you don't have a heart attack. Your body does respond. Okay. Any questions on this? Or any other questions? Yes.
So if you move back to an area with
Then you go
more
back.
altitude,
Okay, then you go back. Yeah. You come back to Florida, and after a while, you drop it down. Then you go back to Colorado again, and you got to go through it again.
How long does it take to adjust? I mean,
A few weeks. Slowly, over a period of time, it will. Polycythemia vera?
Yes.
That's a disease condition. That's usually due to a red bone marrow tumor the red bone marrow is just simply kicking out red blood cells. And the problem is you have so many red blood cells that blood becomes very viscous and very difficult to circulate, and it's so thick. Okay, but in secondary polycythemia, you don't have the high numbers, but it's enough to help accommodate for the lower oxygen carrying or oxygen content in the area of breathing. Okay, let's take a look now for white blood cells. The leukocytes. And as you know, these have the typical organelles that we see in most body cells. They have a nucleus, they have the organelles that we associate, okay, endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi, and so on, mitochondria, blah, 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 okay? But they're much less numerous, and you probably noticed that when you look at the blood smears. You had to hunt a little bit for these. They tend to stand out because they have a dark staining nucleus, so these prepared tissue preparations, or blood smears that you look at. Usually somewhere between about 4 and 11,000 per cubic milliliter versus maybe 4.5 to 6 million red blood cells in the same body. A higher than normal red blood cell or white blood cell count is called leukocytosis. A lower than normal white blood cell count is called leukopenia. And of course, as you already know, the main function of white blood cells is to protect your body against foreign invaders, largely microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so on, get into the body, some of which are very deadly. They're pathogens, disease-causing organisms. If it weren't for our immune system and our white blood cells, we'd never survive. We'd die shortly after birth. So it's very important. We live in an ocean of microorganisms, and they're constantly getting into our bodies, and we're constantly fighting them, okay? That's why occasionally you get sick. But in most cases, you recover, perfectly healthy again. Then should you encounter that organism again, bang, you're ready for it. And you attack it and destroy it before it has a chance to cause disease, or the disease will be much milder than the original. Because your immune system remembers what it encounters. Very important. And that's why you don't even have to have a disease. You get immunization and not have to go through the ravages of disease and still be protected. Okay. White blood cells are mostly modal, capable of independent movement. They move like an amoeba through cytoplasmic extension. We call that amoeboid movement. They also exhibit what's called diapedesis. That is, they can change their shape like an amoeba and squeeze through small areas or small spaces between the cells that make up the walls of our blood vessels, namely the capillaries. And you're continually leaking fluid from your blood capillaries into the tissue spaces. If we have an infection, we have inflammation, then those capillaries become even leakier and you leak more fluid. The purpose, of course, is to bring in white blood cells, antibodies, and things to help fight the infection. That's part of what we call inflammation. How do they know where to go? They follow a chemical trail. And that's called chemotaxis. Movement in response to chemical is called chemotaxis. Yes?
That movement, amyloid movement, can you explain what it is?
Amoeboid movement is like the way an amoeba would move, throws off cytoplasmic extension, kind of flows into it.
Oh.
Okay, that's called amoeboid movement, because they look like an amoeba, basically, when they move. Okay? And then when they're attracted by materials from the dead cells or the dying cells, also chemicals released by the microorganisms that are in the site where there's infection, and also by chemicals released by other white blood cells. They're following a chemical trail. Again, movement in response to chemicals called